In this video, I'll be offering my thoughts on Viltrox's Autofocus 27mm f1.2 lens for Fujifilm X. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Now, as you might have seen from a post on my community page a few weeks back, I've got my hands on Viltrox's 27mm f1.2 for the Fujifilm X system. Now, I've been testing it pretty extensively over the past month or so, and in this video I want to offer you basically the good, the bad, and also give you my thoughts on what I think it brings to the table and who I think it's for. But before we get started though, Viltrox did see my 13mm review and offered to send me this lens for testing. I do get to keep the lens, but Viltrox has no input on this review and they don't get to see it before it goes live. So all thoughts here, good and bad, have been formed over the month or so that I've been working with the lens. So with all that out of the way, let's get straight into the review. Okay, so build quality. Now, as with the 13mm and 75mm lenses from Viltrox, the 27mm is really well built. Now, it's quite large and heavy to accommodate all the glass required for that f1.2 maximum aperture, so you definitely notice its presence both in your bag and on the camera, unlike the 27mm pancake lenses that are out there. Now, Viltrox quotes its weight at 560 grams, and it definitely feels like you have a lens attached when this one is mounted. So there's nothing discreet, low profile about this lens. I did get a couple of questions with regards to the size and weight of this lens in the Q&A on my community page, so let's address those here as well. Now, on smaller bodies, like for example something like an XE4, this is definitely going to feel very, very front heavy, but you'll be supporting the lens with your left hand while you're shooting anyway, so as long as you're not trying to shoot one-handed with this lens, it really shouldn't be an issue. But for those who do find holding a larger lens on a small body uncomfortable, this is probably better suited to the XT or XH series bodies. Now, the other thing is that due to its size, especially with the hood on, you are going to lose around 25% of the OVF on X Pro bodies, if you like to work that way. Now, of course, you could just switch over to the EVF and that will basically mitigate the problem, but I know that a lot of people do like to work with the OVF since they did pay the premium for it, so it is going to be an issue on X Pro bodies. Now, one nice to have with this lens is the collection of rubber gaskets at all the different possible points of ingress here, and these basically help in keeping dust and water out. So for those who like to have that little extra peace of mind when it comes to weather sealing, this lens will definitely tick that box as well. Now, the focus ring is large and has a decent amount of resistance. Now, it's not quite as loose as the 75mm f1.2, but also not quite as difficult to turn as we find on some other wide aperture lenses, to basically aid in precise focusing. So of course this is also a focus by wire system, so that's not really too much of an issue, but I would say it's one of the better feeling focus rings that I've worked with in focus by wire. The aperture ring is also a completely different feeling one to the ones that you'll find on the 13mm and 75mm lenses from Viltrox. Now, it has much less sort of definite and much less audible clicks, which can make it easy to skip over a lot more stops than you were hoping to. Now, in and of itself, it's not really an issue, but it does take a little bit of getting used to if you're used to working with the other Viltrox lenses. One final thing of note with the build quality of this lens is that the USB-C port for upgrading the firmware is still on the lens mount. Now, as I mentioned in my 13mm f1.4 review, I'm not a huge fan of this because it's being, rotated on and off of my very, very expensive camera bodies quite frequently, and I have this constant, possibly unfounded fear that it might scratch and damage the mount. Now, overall, my complaints about the build quality here are the slightly looser feeling aperture ring and the firmware port still being on the lens mount. So otherwise, the lens feels really, really well built and really no complaints to be had here. Focusing with this lens is driven by a stepping motor, and it is swift, silent, and accurate. Now, I've had no troubles at all trusting it to just zip into place and deliver the goods in both AFS and AFC. Now, it's really hard to fault Viltrox's stepping motors. They do a great job, and honestly, I hope that Fujifilm is paying attention a little bit with this mounting competition and starts to do away with their DC coreless motors in future lenses. Now, because this is a stepping motor, it's not quite as quick and precise as a linear motor in AFC. So I did notice a little bit of a slowdown when working with continuous shooting in AFC. So I have my camera set to focus priority so that the shutter only trips when the camera can confirm focus. Now, with Fujifilm's linear motors, such as the one that's in the XF33mm f1.4, I can easily have the camera motor off perfectly in focus frames of a subject running towards me at 10 frames a second, which is what I have my camera set to. But with the Viltrox 27mm, I found that would slow down to around sort of 5 or 6 frames a second as the camera tried to lock focus. And this is still really good for a stepping motor, but it does show where the benefits of a linear motor can be for photographers. Let's just say this up front, this is one heck of a sharp lens. Now, in the central area of the frame, it's great from f1.2, and it sees a little bit of an improvement in sharpness and contrast by f2, and then it hits its peak sharpness by f4 and f5.6. And from there, it starts to soften up again at f8, and by f11 and f16, it's definitely what I would call soft and probably wouldn't work with those apertures. Now, the great news here is that the apertures that this lens is going to be used at most often are all excellent. When it comes to the corners, things are a little bit soft, but not bad, wide open, and this quickly cleans up by f2 as well. From there on, it follows the same pattern as the center of the frame and just gets sharper and sharper until f5.6 and then softens up again at f8. And when comparing sharpness with some of Fujifilm's sharper primes, like the XF33mm f1.4 and the XF56mm WR, I would say that both Fujifilm lenses have a slight edge in terms of detail all the way across the frame, but we have to get in really, really deep to compare them. But when I'm shooting these lenses side by side, I haven't really noticed a difference that would worry me in terms of the resulting images. The 27mm just sort of slots into my kit and gets the job done. To answer another question from my community page, this lens is absolutely every bit as sharp as the 75mm f1.2, and I would not hesitate to pair the two. The 75mm does hold its own a little bit more after f8 than the 27mm does, but overall they follow a pretty similar pattern. So we'll keep sharpness short and sweet. This lens will resolve more detail than most people will ever need, and it's very, very close to the sharpest of Fujifilm's lenses and a really good match for the Viltrox 75mm in my testing, so no complaints here either. As we'd expect from an ultra-fast lens like this, there is quite a bit of vignetting when used wide open. So at f1.2, it's around 2.5 stops darker in the extreme corners, and that fades into the center. Now, at f2, that improves quite a bit, and by f2.8, the vignette is almost completely gone. And then that stays true for the rest of the aperture range. There's basically no vignette after that. Now, even at f1.2 though, it's easy to sort of mostly correct for the vignette in post-production. You know, a quick slide to the right and the manufacturer profile in Capture One brings the vignette back down to sort of a much more acceptable range. But the extreme corners still remain darker, as we saw with the Viltrox 13mm. Okay, editing Dylan here, just jumping in very quickly because I've had a conversation with Viltrox and they have confirmed that the profiles that are in Capture One are not theirs. They're not included in the lens and they're not copied over or anything like that. They're basically just a generic thing, and that they are trying to work with Capture One to be able to include profiles in a future release. But if you are an Adobe user, they do have profiles available on their website, so you can head over and get those and do a little bit better of a job at correcting the vignette than I am able to do. Anyhow, so back to the video. Again, with an extremely fast lens like this, I usually expect to see significant coma, but it's really, really minor on the 27mm. Now, there's definitely a little splaying of pin lights in the corners, when you're talking about using the lens at f1.2 or f1.4, but it goes away after that. So for those who might want a bit of a tighter field of view for their astrophotography, this might be a good option. Green and purple fringing is another thing that we're always worried about with fast aperture lens designs, and the 27mm f1.2 hasn't been able to escape it entirely. So in extreme situations, I've definitely seen fringing around the autofocus edges. As we can see here, I've lined up what is basically a nightmare situation for any lens. It's just a collection of backlit reflective surfaces, and honestly I expect to see quite a bit of fringing from any lens in this situation. The 27mm is able to control it quite well, even at f1.2, so as we see behind the plane of focus, there's a little bit of green fringing around the edges, but nothing too dramatic and nothing that's going to ruin a photograph. Now in front of the plane of focus, we also see some purple fringing around the high contrast edge of the disc rotor. And again, it's only really noticeable when we zoom in, and it's not likely to ruin your images. Another easy way to see where this shows up is in the bokeh balls. So looking at this quick night test, we can easily see that there is plenty of fringing to be found. Now honestly, this isn't a level of color fringing that I'd be concerned about with my own photography, but it is definitely present and it is definitely something to be aware of. Before we take a look at the quality of the bokeh that you'll see in sort of most everyday situations, I want to take a moment to look at the bokeh balls again. Now, hopefully this will help to answer one of the questions that I got on my community page about the bokeh as the lens is stopped down. So in this first image at f1.2, we get almost perfect circles in the center of the frame that gradually take on a cat's eye effect towards the corners. Now, we see this a lot, especially with ultra-fast lenses, so no surprises there. But as we start to stop the lens down, the 11 aperture blades maintain an almost perfectly circular shape right the way through the aperture range. So for those who like to work with bokeh balls in their images, this lens will likely deliver the goods. Now let's also take a look at a simple shot with some foliage in the background to see how this would play out in a sort of a day-to-day situation for me. Now, we'll start with a simple close-up. As you can see, things start out quite smooth at f1.2, and then as we begin to stop down, the blades of grass start to become quite a bit more defined around the edges, and it gets a little bit messier, but the bokeh is definitely not harsh or distracting in my opinion. Now for me, an out-of-focus foreground and background should basically just not draw attention from the subject in most situations, and that's really why I love lenses like the XF 56mm f1.2 and Laowa's 33mm f 0.95. Now, both provide this sort of beautifully smooth background that really allows the subject to stand out. And the 27mm also does quite a good job of this in most situations, but with how sharp the lens was, I was expecting a significant compromise in the bokeh quality, but Viltrox seems to have done a really good job here. Now, another question that I got on my community page when I asked about this lens was to compare it to the XF 33mm f1.4. Now of course this is a review of the Viltrox lens, so we'll just do a quick comparison out of curiosity here. I've done quite a few tests, but this shot exemplifies the main differences for me. The Viltrox can be a little smoother when used wide open at its minimum focus distance, but at comparable subject distances, they are very similar. Now, the Viltrox does have a little more of that cat's eye bokeh towards the edges, whereas the Fujifilm has a more consistent bokeh all the way across the frame. So back to the cat's eye bokeh in the far corners. Now, this can lead to a small amount of that sort of swirl effect in certain situations, and some people might not like that, but I find that it can sort of help to draw your attention towards a central subject, and I enjoy making use of it. So no real complaints from me there. So overall, I find the bokeh this lens produces to be pleasing, and I'm happy to use it amongst my other Fujifilm primes. Now, its ability to separate a subject nicely at a variety of distances through depth of field, and also still have non-distracting bokeh, makes it a really useful lens for me. Flare and ghosting with this lens are what I have come to call Viltroxy. So much like the 13 and 75mm lenses before it, you really need to be careful when there are bright lights getting around the edge of the frame with the 27mm lens. So flare can sneak in and sort of wash out the entire image with a color cast that's really difficult to remove. Now, I noticed it first in a corporate event that I was photographing here in Seoul, and the lights in the ceiling made for, a really great background that added a little something special to the images of basically people networking. But every now and again, one of those lights would just catch the lens at an odd angle and the flare would just wash over the image. Now, as for the ghosting, it's not the worst that I've seen, and it can actually be quite interesting at times. Now, for example, with the sun just at the edge of the frame, I was able to bring out this sort of burst of light and an interesting rainbow shape at the bottom of the image here. So the reduction in contrast, though, from the flare was quite large, and it took a little bit of work to bring this back into being a usable image. But I do feel like in certain situations, it can add a little bit to the feeling, like it does here, that sort of early morning feeling. Unfortunately, using the included lens hood, despite its size, doesn't really do a lot to prevent flare and ghosting with this lens. So it's definitely something that you need to be on the lookout for, and you definitely want to be shading the lens or changing your composition slightly if it shows up undesirably. The 27mm does produce sunstars from small lights in the frame, but they're really nothing to write home about. Now, they begin forming at around about f2.8, and they continue to get larger throughout the aperture range. Now, honestly, I feel like this is the sort of sunstar that most lenses should aim to produce. They're definitely there, but they don't become sort of an overwhelming graphical element of their own in a simple cityscape like this one. Whenever I get a new lens, I like to just take it out, take a walk with it, and photograph anything that catches my attention, just to sort of get a feel for how the lens operates and how images will turn out with a variety of light, different subject matter, in different situations. Now, after my first walk with the 27mm, I was convinced immediately that I could trust it on a client shoot as well. So my first client shoot after the lens arrived was a proposal and couple session on Jeju Island. Now, with the scenes that I had, I worked almost exclusively with the 27mm on one body and the 75mm on the other. There were only a couple of specific images where I needed to go for another focal length on this shoot, so I was really able to, get a feel for how the 27mm performed. Now, focus was excellent and the images were looking absolutely wonderful in camera. So I was able to continue shooting wide open for a good portion of the session, and as you can see from these samples, at a distance of around 4 or 5 meters, it's really easy to get enough depth of field to ensure that two people on slightly different planes are acceptably in focus while still maintaining separation. Now this for me is one of the areas where the 27mm really shines. Now it's wide enough in its field of view to take it a decent swatch of the scene around you, but it has a fast enough aperture to separate subjects from the background and still gather plenty of light, no matter what the light levels are, while keeping that background and foreground somewhat legible, but out of focus enough that you can really draw attention to the subjects. Now, of course, if you want to focus in close and get some extremely shallow depth of field, that's absolutely possible with this lens, as it has a minimum focus distance of 28 centimeters. So getting close to something like these delightful hot sauces from our Filipino brothers at Don Julio, basically obliterating all detail in the background, is easily achievable with the 27mm. For my purposes, where I found this focal length and aperture combination to be most useful has been in my event and couple photography. Now, it's a really good balance between the 23 and 33mm focal lengths. Now, in situations where I might want to have those two focal lengths, one on each body, to capture slightly different fields of view, I've usually found that the 27mm allows for both types of shot that I might want, and basically frees my second camera up to have a vastly different focal length, something like the 13mm, 56, 75mm, depending on the situation. So also that fast aperture means that I've been able to work with all sorts of light levels without having to worry about changing for a faster lens. So to wrap up, this is a very large and heavy lens that produces extremely sharp images and very good bokeh when you want it. Now, it does all of that for basically not much more money than Fujifilm's own 27mm f2.8, and even a fraction of the cost of something like the 23mm 1.4 or 33mm 1.4 from Fujifilm. Now, overall, it's an excellent value package that really only has a couple of flaws, and those are in flare resistance and the size and weight of the lens. So who would I recommend this for? Well, if you're tossing up whether to get an XF 33mm or 23mm because you either can't afford both or don't want to own both, this might be a really good middle ground for you. Now, the image quality is definitely there to play with the big boys, and if you don't mind carrying around the weight, it's definitely a good option. But would I recommend it for people who love using the XF 27mm f2.8? Probably not. The main draw to that little lens is its size and weight. With that, you may as well not even have a lens on the camera. With the Viltrox, you might as well be doing weight training. So in every other respect though, the Viltrox really does outdo the Fujifilm lens, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in my upcoming comparison video. Now, finally, I would like to answer one last question from the community that went a little something like this. Someone please tell me that I don't need this lens because I really want it. And to that I say, you definitely don't need this lens. Just like you don't need any lens, but you really do want it, and you'll be super happy if you get it. If you do decide to purchase this lens, I would really appreciate you using the affiliate link below, as it does help to support the channel and keeps me making videos like this one. So As always, thank you guys for watching, and if you haven't already given the video a thumbs up or subscribed to the channel, I would also appreciate your support in that way if you found this video in any way useful. As always, do let me know in the comments if you have any further questions about this lens. I'll be happy to try and answer them as best I can. And finally, enjoy the slideshow, and I'll see you in the next video.